October 24th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Roscoe Tillman pressed his cheek against the wet wood of a rifle stock he'd carried for exactly 12 days, in a foxhole that had already started to flood. He was 20 years old, a wheat farmer's son from North Dakota who had never fired a shot at another human being in his life. Beside him, a Marine who'd been on this island for 67 days glanced at the new rifle in Roscoe's hands. The look on that Marine's face wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was something closer to envy. The kind of look a man gives another man holding a tool he doesn't trust yet, but wishes he did. Roscoe didn't know it, but his survival tonight had already been decided. Not by him, not by the enemy massing in the jungle beyond the wire. It had been decided 3 years earlier, in a Washington office that smelled of pipe tobacco, by a man Roscoe would never meet, who did something almost no army on earth had the nerve to do. He admitted, in writing, that the rifle was wrong, and then he fixed it. The landing craft dropped its ramp into ankle-deep water, and Roscoe Tillman stepped off into the Pacific for the first time in his life. The salt stung a blister he'd been nursing since Fort Ord. Around him, men from the 164th hauled crates up the sand, boots sinking, breath short, nobody talking more than they had to. His crate was heavier than it looked. Inside, wrapped in cosmoline that smelled like a machine shop, were the rifles. Roscoe had fired his exactly 40 times. 2 weeks of training, most of it standing in a Texas heat that had nothing in common with this. He kept telling himself 40 rounds was enough. He kept not believing it. He pried the crate open on the beach because he needed to see it again, needed his hands to remember the weight of it before the jungle swallowed them whole. The stock was cool despite the heat. The action clicked shut clean under his thumb, and for a second that was the only sound in the world. Somewhere past the tree line, men who'd been fighting on this island for over 2 months were watching him unload it. He didn't know yet what was in their faces. He only knew that 12 days ago this rifle had been a stranger to him, and tonight it was the only thing standing between him and whatever came next. The first Marine who spoke to him didn't ask his name. He nodded at the rifle and said, "That the one that jams up in the mud?" Roscoe didn't have an answer. The Marine walked off before he needed one. It kept happening. Small comments, tossed sideways, never cruel exactly, but never kind either. Someone mentioned a report. Some test the Corps had run the year before. Something about mud and a bolt that wouldn't budge once it got dirty enough. Nobody had read it. Everybody seemed to know it by heart anyway, the way rumors travel faster than the paper they're printed on. Roscoe found himself checking the action more than he needed to, wiping it down when it was already clean. He told himself he was being careful. Some nights he wondered if he was just looking for a reason to distrust it before it had the chance to fail him first. What scared him more than the rifle jamming was what it would mean if it did. He was already the new guy, the one who hadn't buried a friend yet, hadn't eaten captured rice, hadn't earned anything on this island except a boat ride in. If the rifle failed him in front of men who'd survived 67 days without one, he wasn't sure there'd be a difference anymore between the weapon's flaws and his own. He thought about his father's hands more than he expected to, out here, rough, cracked at the knuckles from 40 years of wheat, hands that had never once looked unsure of themselves. Roscoe had grown up watching those hands work and wondering if his own would ever match them. He'd been the youngest of 4 boys, the one who got left behind for chores while his brothers went off to whatever counted as adventure in a county that small. He used to stand at the edge of the North Field and watch the road, waiting for something to happen to him instead of around him. Enlisting had felt like the first thing he'd ever chosen for himself. He remembered the recruiting office, how easy it had been to sign his name, how hard it had been to explain to his mother why he wanted to. He hadn't known how to tell her the truth, that he needed proof, some kind of proof, that he wasn't just the boy who stayed behind. Now, lying in the dark with a rifle he didn't fully trust, that old fear had followed him across an ocean and found him anyway. It didn't wear the shape of his brothers anymore. It wore the shape of every Marine who'd looked at him sideways since he landed, and the quiet, terrible thought that when the moment came, he might be the one who broke first. 3 years before Roscoe was born, a French-Canadian boy in Connecticut was sweeping floors in a textile mill, teaching himself English one word at a time. Nobody watching him then would have guessed that the rifle in Roscoe's hands, the one he still didn't trust, had started as a stubborn idea in that same boy's head decades later. John Garand never finished school past the age of 12. What he had instead was a fascination with machines that bordered on obsession and a gun club near his family's house that left target rifles lying around between matches. By the time the Army handed him an impossible assignment, build the first successful semi-automatic rifle a major power had ever fielded. He'd spent years teaching himself engineering at night, one correspondence course at a time. 15 years of failure followed. Prototypes that jammed, cartridges too fierce for the mechanisms meant to tame them, a cavalcade of dead ends most men would have abandoned. His first real answer was elegant on paper: gas trapped at the muzzle, redirected backward to drive the action. It worked in testing. It looked finished. It wasn't. Somewhere in the space between a drawing board in Springfield and a rifle in a soldier's hands, that elegance would start to come apart, screw by screw, exactly the way things do when they leave the people who understand them best. In the spring of 1939, a man named Guy Jury sat at a desk in Washington and typed a letter that Roscoe would never read, never hear about, never even know existed. Jury was an ordnance officer, not a soldier who'd ever face a charging enemy, and the letter he wrote to a colonel at Fort Benning admitted something the Army had spent over a decade and a fortune trying not to admit. The rifle in production, the one already standardized, already being drilled with on parade grounds across the country, was wrong. Jury and Garand had been quietly redesigning the front end for months. No screw-on cap, no misalignment risk. A simpler, stronger system, driven by gas, bled straight from the barrel. By October of that year, 53 days after Hitler marched into Poland, the Ordnance Committee made it official in writing. What followed was almost unheard of. The Army stopped its own assembly line. 48,000 rifles, already built, already good enough to ship, were pulled back and stripped down instead. No other major power at war or nearing it did anything close. Roscoe wouldn't be drafted for 2 more years. He had no way of knowing that his life might already have been decided by a stranger's willingness to admit a mistake before it cost anyone anything. They moved into the eastern perimeter on the 23rd, digging in beside Marines who had names for every rock and root on that hillside, because they'd been staring at them for 2 months straight. Roscoe dug his foxhole next to a kid named Whitfield, barely older than him, who talked with his hands even when nobody was listening. The rain started that afternoon and didn't stop. Somewhere down the line, a Marine offered Roscoe a cigarette without being asked, cupping the match against the wet, with the kind of practiced ease that only comes from doing something 100 times before. Roscoe took it more because refusing felt like an insult than because he wanted it. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say to a stranger you might not see standing tomorrow. Whitfield cracked a joke about the food, something about how he'd trade his rifle for a plate of his mother's cooking, and a few men laughed too hard for how unfunny it actually was. Roscoe laughed too. It felt good to laugh, even for a second, even knowing why they were really doing it. By nightfall, the joking stopped. Word came down the line that the Japanese were massing beyond the wire, thousands of them, and every man went quiet in his own way. Checking his rifle one more time like checking it again might change something. It started as noise before it became shapes. Screaming somewhere in the dark beyond the wire, then whistles. Then the ground itself seemed to move as the first wave broke from the tree line. Roscoe's mouth went dry. Every doubt he'd carried since the beach, every sideways glance from every Marine, vanished the instant his hands found the trigger, and didn't ask his permission before pulling it. He fired without counting. That was the part nobody had told him, how little time there was to think between muzzle flashes, how the rifle seemed to keep up with a fear his own body couldn't. Men were falling in front of him, some close enough that he'd remember their faces without ever knowing their names. Then his rifle went silent mid-breath, and a clip came ringing out of the receiver, high and metallic, cutting through even the gunfire for one impossible second. The old warning flashed through him before he could stop it. They'll hear it. They'll know you're empty. His hands went cold for half a heartbeat, but his fingers were already moving, already sliding a fresh clip home the way he'd done it 40 times in training and hadn't known he'd remember under fire. The bolt slammed forward. He was firing again before the fear had time to finish its sentence. Dawn came gray and slow, the way it does after a night that felt like it would never end. The wire in front of the line was littered with things Roscoe made himself not look at too closely. Whitfield was alive, sitting with his back against the dirt wall of his foxhole, hands still shaking around a canteen he couldn't quite bring to his mouth. Roscoe sat with his rifle across his knees and thought about the ping. He'd heard it maybe a dozen times in the dark, that same bright metallic sound each time his clip went empty, and each time some old, half-remembered rumor had whispered that it would be the last sound he ever made. It never was. He tried to remember a single moment where the sound had cost him anything. A second of hesitation, a step closer from the men rushing him, and he couldn't find one. The reload had always come before the danger did. His hands had known what to do faster than his fear could catch up. He almost laughed, sitting there in the mud. All that worry, carried across an ocean, and it turned out the sound that scared him most had never once been the thing trying to kill him. The men trying to kill him hadn't even known his rifle by name. He didn't think about it again until days later, cleaning the rifle by lamplight, running a rag down the barrel out of habit more than need. It struck him then, quietly, the way important things sometimes arrive without any warning at all. He had survived the worst night of his life holding a piece of metal that a stranger named Garand had spent 15 years failing to get right, and that another stranger, a man named Jury he would never meet, had refused to let stay wrong. Roscoe had spent so many nights on that island afraid he was the weak link, the new guy, the untested one, the boy who hadn't earned his place yet. It had never once occurred to him that the rifle in his hands had already been tested in a way he couldn't see, torn apart and rebuilt by men in an office 3 years before he'd even signed his name at the recruiting desk. He thought about his father's hands again, and for the first time understood that strength wasn't only the kind you could see in a man's knuckles. Sometimes it looked like a signature on a piece of paper nobody would ever read. Sometimes survival wasn't a single brave night. It was every honest decision that came before it, made by people who never knew his name and never needed to.